we have Vicki Bentley today with us. She is a fabulous woman. You're going to love her. She's homeschooled 17 kids, and she is a joyful mother for sure. She raised 8 daughters. She fostered nearly 50 children. She's also grandma of 23. I call that parenting 2.0. I can testify. It's amazing. 23 grandbabies and 11 great grandkids. She's written books, done blogs, and an education consultant with HSLDA for the past 15, 16 years. Is that?
Yeah,
Yes.
almost 16.
We're in for a treat. Vicki has a blog, The Everyday Homemakers. She's written the Homeschool Planner, the Everyday Family Chore System. I feel like I could go on and on. I feel so blessed that you would share your wisdom with us tonight. So, Vicki, thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Keisha, for having me. I always love being out in Colorado, and so it's nice I get to be in Colorado without having to fly.
Okay, so tonight our topic, I'm talking about how to approach homeschooling when you were not homeschooling. We're talking about mid-year. So I just want to know first, before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about your own homeschool journey?
Goodness, my oldest four were not homeschooled. I was telling Keisha earlier, I have a 20-year spread in my kids. My oldest daughter right now is 55 and my youngest is 35. So there's a 20-year spread. And we call them the big girls and the little girls. The four older girls all went to public school. We didn't know about homeschooling. And then when the younger girls, were at that age level, I don't really remember why we started with the first one. We homeschooled the number 5 child for a couple of months. It was almost like an unschooling type of thing because I didn't have any material yet. And then when the material came, life fell apart because I think I was a little too structured and too rigid. I thought I was doing something wrong. So I put her back into her conventional school. And then a few years later, she asked to be homeschooled again. And at that point, I had one daughter who had some special needs. I had 2 daughters who were in the public school system and had been tested as in their gifted and talented program. And I just was having some issues meeting the needs of my special needs daughter. So I just pulled them all out. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? Because they were in these wonderful programs at school. And I thought, I am not going to be able to tailor a program like the program that they were in the school system. And I was right. I couldn't. It was so much better. It was not because the school system well, but because I could tailor everything we did to what they needed. Instead of a 1 hour pull out a day, then we could just make our whole approach about what they were gifted in or what they were interested in. And I could meet the needs of my daughter with cerebral palsy all as, as she needed right there and not rely on others. And I actually wrote about this I'm going to make reference to a few of my blog posts simply because I've gone into more detail about some of these for our listeners who may not want to hear it all right now, but want to read it later at everydayhomemaking.com, which is where my blog is. I have an article called Finding the Gift in Your Child. And what I discovered was every child is gifted. They're just gifted in different things, and they're not all gifted academically, but they're gifted in some other way. And so that was what I loved about starting our homeschooling journey, was being able to tailor things to my kids' needs. But
I love that. And actually, even just how you approached and said, well, I did better, not because the school wasn't doing well. You season everything with grace every time I hear you. So thank you. I appreciate that. And that kind of leads me into my next question. How would you help somebody who maybe, because it's March right now, maybe they started in January and they feel like the last 2 months have been terrible, or like you started and then you ended up putting your child in school and they felt like a failure. So do you have anything to say to those families?
I guess one of the first things I would say is when you're starting to homeschool, you're starting a new job. If you've ever started a new job in anything, even if it's a job with which you're familiar, then when you enter this new territory, it suddenly feels like everybody knows what they're doing but you. It feels like you have to keep asking the questions. If you were in a store, maybe you can't remember how to clock in. You can't remember how you do certain things, what certain routines are. You have to keep asking the questions over and over and over again, and it feels like it will makes sense to you, and you're scared to ask anybody because everybody else knows what they're doing, it looks like. And I find with homeschooling a lot of times we're concerned that it feels like everybody else knows what they're doing and we don't. But if you've ever been in that circumstance with that new job, you probably remember that even though it felt that way at first, after a while, it just becomes more second nature. It becomes more automatic. And so, a few weeks in, you kind of find your rhythm. And then maybe a few months in, you realize I didn't have to ask anybody any questions. So, it really will become more comfortable. Um, if for some reason you don't find that rhythm, it's probably not anything you're doing right, wrong, whatever. It's probably that what you're using isn't a good fit. Your approach may not be the best fit for your family, the material you're choosing. And so I always encourage people, give us a call, give me a call, talk to another homeschooling parent, call the CHEC office, and talk through some different options. I had a mom who called me once at the end of a school year. She hadn't talked to me at the beginning of the year, but at the end of the school year, she called and she said, this is my first year homeschooling and I hated it and I don't ever want to do this again. Some of you are probably thinking this, but what, so we backed up a little bit and said, well, tell me what's going on. And so she said, I feel like all I do all day long is I do this material and this material and this material. And I feel like I'm just checking off the boxes so we can be finished. And then I can do what I want to do with my kids. And I said, well, what is it you want to do with your kids? And she said, well, I want to take them to the museum and I want to go on nature walks and I want to do some art projects. I said, that is your family's homeschool style. The other stuff is busy work. So let's see how we can minimize the busy work, the thing that's not working well for you. That may be a great fit for somebody else, but it wasn't a good fit for them. Let's see how we can minimize this and maximize what you're loving. My goal in homeschooling for anybody is let's figure out who you are as a family and then make your homeschooling style and approach fit into who you are as a family, not the other way around. So
I love that. And just to summarize what I heard you say that I love is there's something not working, not someone not working.
very
So
good. True.
it's not failing the mom failing. It's just
Oh,
something needs to be tweaked. We got to experiment. It's like a science experiment, right?
that's right.
I love it. Okay, and I've heard you use the analogy of planning a trip when it comes to homeschooling, and that resonated with me. I thought it was a great visual. And so can you explain to us what you mean by homeschooling is like planning a trip?
Sure. Well, homeschooling is a real trip. But I like to think of homeschooling as this long journey. It's not the quick trip. I was I was in it for the long haul. Most of you probably starting out, or at least hoping that you'll be in it for the long haul. But I also like to use the analogy of taking a trip because I get lost really, really, really easily. I have no internal compass when it comes to geography. Um, I tell a story about how I used to work at the Virginia Convention for 11 years. We have a large conference center, and every year I would get lost trying to get out of the parking garage at the convention center, and I would drive around up and down, and I'd call somebody crying, "Get me out! Get me out!" And I tell people, my goal in helping you get started homeschooling is to help you not get lost in the parking garage of homeschooling. So when you go on a trip and you find yourself off course, you don't quit and start over. If I'm going from here to Pittsburgh, I don't say, "Oh, I missed a turn someplace, so now I got to go back to where I started from," or or I don't quit. I just figure out, okay, where am I? Where did I want to be? Now, how can I get closer to where I want to be? Maybe the new route is even better than what I originally planned. So homeschooling is, it's kind of a
It's a process.
it's a process. It's a process.
Yeah. And then I heard you say talking about that, like knowing where you are versus where you want to go and
Right.
taking the time to really figure that out. What do you mean? How would
Yeah.
you, how does that flesh out?
Sure. Well, we talk about that a lot when we're looking at choosing curriculum, because somebody will say, "How do I choose curriculum? What's the first step?" And the whole word curriculum comes from the French word courir, which means to run, like to run a course. And so your curriculum is your roadmap, your GPS, your directions. So when somebody calls me and says, "I need help choosing curriculum," it's basically saying, "Vicki, I need directions." So if I were to call you, if I were lost, if I'm calling you for directions, I said, Kasia, I'm so lost. I'm so lost. I need directions. You'd probably want to know two things. You probably want to know, where are you,
Are you, Vicky? Yeah.
and where are you trying to go?
Mhm.
So it's the same thing with homeschooling. We want to know where your child is academically and where is reasonable to get, where are you trying to get by the end of, we'll say, for example, this year. Now, if you're just starting homeschooling, then you probably know where your child is academically because you just kind of been coming alongside them. They're 3, 4, 5 years old. If you're pulling a child out of a conventional school system, you may have no idea where that student is academically. You may know what their grades are, but you may not know what they know. And so there are some tools, we may talk about that a little bit later on as well, but there are some tools that can help you determine where your child is and then what's reasonable for you to aim toward this, during that school year. So, and that's one of the things I do in private consulting is just let's talk um, personally about this, and we'll get into the nitty gritty of what your child enjoys, what he knows. I'll guide you to some free resources to assess where he is and so forth. So
Okay. Yeah, that this is great because that is something that I hear often families worry about is they're worried about gaps. They're worried about not being able to fill in what their child doesn't know or what if they miss something. So, do you have any thoughts on that? Just the gaps or you mentioned figuring out where they need to go.
that's a really great one because everybody has gaps. Nobody learns everything there is to know. The key is determining for your family, what do you think is a good education? What's important for your child to know? Now, again, we go back to that whole I don't know what a typical second grader knows. I don't know what a typical fifth grader knows. I try to steer away from your child being at grade level because grade level is an artificial construct. But the fact is, learning happens on a continuum. So, math and language arts are skills subjects. Science and history and those other things are content subjects. So, you can pick up, if you've taken a child out of conventional school, you can pick up wherever you want to on science and history and some of those things, like within reason. But with math and language, we want to know what they already know because we're building on what they already know. And we don't want to assume they know something that they don't know. And then we're perpetuating um, that lapse in their understanding. So, as far as the gaps go, you get to decide what you think is important. Now, most parents think if I just had something to go by, it would be a good starting point. So there are some tools for you. I have an article at the website called "What Should I Be Teaching?" And it doesn't tell you literally what to teach your kids, but it helps you decide as a parent, what do you think is important for your child to know? Here are some suggestions for you. There are, at the end of the article, I have linked some scope and sequence checklists or skills checklists, guidelines to give you an idea. Please hold these loosely, but
Mhm.
it gives you an idea of what a typical student in a conventional classroom might learn in those grade levels in, say, math, language, social studies, and science. Doesn't mean your child has to do those things, but it can give you an idea of some of the milestones and you can get a sense. You may say, oh, he already knows this. He knows this. He knows this. We're going to do this next year. Or I don't think anybody should ever have to learn this. Totally up to you, but it can help to have that starting point.
Mhm. I love that. So when I'm talking to new homeschoolers, I usually put the impression on them strongly that without vision, the people perish. So what are your thoughts on how do you craft a vision for homeschooling? I mean, we're talking to people who are pulling their kids out of school. So oftentimes it's running away from something.
Yes.
So how do you turn that running away from into running
Yes.
toward?
I appreciate that you said that. Actually, in my notes, I actually had that exact same phrase that we started out running from something instead of we started off by, in my situation, running from something, the system as it was, and we ended up running to something because
Mhm.
we got that vision for a lifestyle of learning. We got a vision for an education that was based more on the Hebrew model of relational learning and less on the Greek model of knowledge based learn education. So I think that as far as a vision statement, I think that's great. I didn't exactly have one. I think it would be helpful to have one, just something that you can put on the refrigerator door that says why we do this. If nothing else, some of those rough days, you may have to go to the refrigerator door and say, "Remind me why I'm doing this." Many, I shouldn't say we all have those days. I'm guessing most of us have those days. But it can help you stay focused when you aren't sure why you're doing it. It doesn't have to be some long statement. It could just be some short.
Mhm.
If somebody down the street asks you, why do you homeschool your kids, and you could be honest with them, and not worry about the repercussions, then what would you say? And so the reason that's important is knowing why you're doing something helps influence what you do and how you do it. So I always say you've got to understand your why, or
Mhm.
you can't move forward easily with your what and your how. The other reason it's important is if you don't understand why you're homeschooling, it will be very easy to be knocked down off of your resolve just gets shot,
Mhm.
especially if your kids start balking. When your kids start saying, "I don't like this," you know, one of my kids once, she's given me permission to tell this story. You can actually find it at the website. It's called "I Hated Homeschooling." My daughter wrote it. Um, she was 14 at the time, and she was a great student, and she'd gone through a lot of uh, uh, homeschool years with us. She was a very successful student. We had a good relationship, but she just had one of those days. She was 14 and she stood at the top of the stairs and she hollered, "I hate you and I hate homeschooling and I'm not doing this to my kids. I'm cooped up all day with 7 kids." And I said, "You 7, I've got 8." She said, "Well, I grow up. I'm not doing this to my children because you're ruining my life." And I just looked at her and I said, it had to have been the Holy Spirit because I'm sure I wouldn't have just said this. I looked at her and I said, "Honey, I am so sorry that you're not happy, but it's not my job to make you happy. It's my job to do what God's called me to do with you. And if Daddy and I did not believe 100% that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, put you back in school in a heartbeat because it would be so much easier for me. But
Mhm.
but when you grow up, if you don't want to do this, that's between you and your husband and God. But Daddy and I are going to stand before God someday and answer for how we've raised you. So, I love you. I'll see you later." And she was a great student. And, it doesn't mean we didn't tweak some things that, what could we improve to make this a little easier? Spoiler, she's now in her 40s. She has 5 kids. And guess what she does? She homeschools and writes homeschool material. Um, but anyway, I tell you that because some of you may be in that situation of you get partway into the homeschool year, maybe day 3, I don't know, and the kids start saying, "I hate this. Why? I don't want to do this." And if you aren't convinced that this is what you need to be doing, at least for right now, it's going to be so hard to stand strong. So I
Mhm.
encourage you to just write it on the wall, on the refrigerator, whatever it is. So
That's really good, and yeah, I want to hear the end of that story, so I'm gonna come back to that because it's so good. I love that story, and the title sounds like one thing, but it really says something else. I love it. So we'll get back to it, but, yeah, let's jump to curriculum because that's why I think it's important to write down vision is and you said it so well, that it shapes the what, and in today, there are so many ways to homeschool. There's so many curriculum options. There's so many programs. So, how let's talk about curriculum. And if you could tell your story of the kitchen box with your box kit on the floor, I would love
crying,
it because it's so
crying.
cool.
When I started homeschooling, I'm dating myself. I mean, like my hair doesn't already date me, but I'm dating myself when I tell you you could not. There weren't a bunch of vendor halls and bunches of magazines. There were about 2 or 3 magazines out there. I ended up buying my curriculum um, from an advertisement in the back of a Christian women's magazine, and it was a box curriculum, like one of those 6th grade in a box types of things. And my kindergartner had 11 subjects. I mailed my check off, because we didn't have the internet. You didn't pay with credit cards were for, they were luxuries. And so I mailed my check off, and the whole time the check is, en route, my stuff hasn't come yet. I'm second guessing myself because I know y'all who are listening have probably done this. You started to do this and then you said, why did I think I could do this? What made me do this? And so I would second guess myself and I'd say, oh, what made me think I could do this? I said, oh, this is going to be fun. And then think, oh, I wonder if I can stop payment on the check. And then, anyway, the box came. I sat in the middle of the kitchen floor with this box of material and I sobbed. I was so overwhelmed and I thought, what have I gotten myself into? There is no way. I'm looking at all of these because this was very textbooky, which is some people love. But it was what I had to get started with. But it was very, very structured. Like I said, 11 subjects for my kindergartner. And I thought I'm going to be doing this till 10 o'clock at night. But we didn't. We got into a rhythm and we were usually done by lunchtime every day. And so I just want to encourage people. Now, did I stick with that? No, some of the people I knew did because it was a good fit for them, and that's great. I was able to look and say, okay, this year, what did I learn from what we did? And you may not need to take the whole year. You may be a faster learner than I was, and you may a few months in say, oh, this isn't the best fit. This is why God made used curriculum cells. And so you can get rid of that. But like I said, your curriculum is your roadmap. Um, and so I do encourage people to consider a little bit of deschooling if you need to. Deschooling is not the same as unschooling, just so you know. Some people confuse those terms. Deschooling is basically it's letting your kids see that they can learn through natural things they're doing in life. It's okay to figure out who you are as a family. Make that homeschooling fit into who you are. It could sometimes even take it could take as much as a month per school year that your kids have been in school to um, to kind of undo the thinking process that they've already had before. Deschooling is really kind of a fancy term for letting go of that old paradigm that you and I have about learning and realize that homeschooling doesn't have to look like school at home. Like I said, it
Right.
may take a month or even more to adjust to that idea that you're really facilitating your child's learning instead of having to teach at him all the time. Um, it's okay if you start off homeschooling by just letting your kids read or learn about something they want to learn about. Or maybe you do some field trips or virtual field trips or work on a hobby or a family project. The key is for your kids to see that learning can still happen in the context of just being a family.
Mhm.
So that was kind of how we got
Oh,
started. That's what actually worked well for us at the beginning. And then when I threw the structure into the mix as strongly as I did. I'm not saying please don't leave here and say Vicki Bentley said don't do structure. But I went from one extreme to the other extreme
huh.
and didn't take into consideration who we were as a family, who my daughter was as a family. So um,
Okay. So in those, yeah, in those curriculum choices, and you're using that phrase deschooling, which I really love. But what I found was in those curriculum choices now, it doesn't have to all be catered to one kind of learning style. So that
correct.
first box curriculum was more the textbook where you just
Yes,
read, and that suits some children for sure.
yes,
But
very
can
much.
you just touch what just a quick overview, like a minute on what are the different learning styles and how to incorporate that into your curriculum
Sure.
option.
Sure. And I do a whole different, like a couple of hours on some of these topics. So I'm trying to distill it down into a
I
couple.
know, sorry.
No, 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 it's okay. The first thing I want to say when we're talking about looking at curriculum is that if you're starting off with younger children, you've been homeschooling them. You just don't think of it as that. For the first 4 or 5 years, you homeschooled your kids. So, what have you been doing with them? Now, how can you take that and just be more intentional with it? Now, we said that math and language arts are skill subjects. So, most people are going to want to do something a little organized, structured in some way with that, because like we said, learning is a continuum, and we want to always be asking ourselves what's next. Some of us aren't comfortable knowing what's next without something that guides us. So there's that. You can technically homeschool with just a library card. You don't have to spend any money, but most people are more comfortable having something somewhat structured for at least math and language arts. So we'll go there. So just let's talk about learning styles a little bit. There's some great books on learning styles. Cynthia Tobias has a book called The Way They Learn, which is really good. Cherie Fuller has a book called Talkers, Watchers, and Doers. It's got a lot of good information in it. Kathy Duffy's website, kathyduffy.com. I think she's got some information in there as well. But I like to think of it as learning preferences. We all learn using all of, and there's a difference between learning modality and learning styles. So we won't get into all of that right here, but the main thing we want to look at to begin with is that all kids learn with all of their senses when they're little. We all use all of our senses, but by the time kids are 6 or 7-ish, they tend to show a preference for certain types of materials. Like I've got one daughter who said, please don't ever give me a video course. I've got another daughter who is very auditory. She hears things, she processes things auditorily. She doesn't notice them necessarily in writing. For example, she would make a lot of math errors, and it was stuff I knew she knew, but she kept getting it wrong. And I kept sending her back and saying, look and see if you can figure out what you did wrong. And she couldn't, until I would say, explain to me, here's your paper. Tell me what you did. And when she started to say it out loud, she'd say, oh, well, that's not right. Well, that's not right. Because she would catch it when she heard it. Another friend of mine was, her daughter was in algebra, and they were kind of butting heads. And she's, I'm gonna let your dad do this. So she looked over one day and she said, her husband was reading the math lesson to the child. And she said, honey, dad's just reading you the lesson out of the book. You can do that yourself. She said, but it makes sense to me when he reads it to me. So
Oh.
some kids just need to hear things. Other kids just want to look at it. The other aspect of learning styles is processing, how kids process. Your learning modality is how you take in information best, and your learning preference or your learning style is how you process what you took in. I am a visual learner. I am also very what Cynthia Tobias would call concrete sequential. I like things to be orderly. I've got numbered. I like bullets, whatever. I've got a daughter who is very random, and if I hadn't known those two things existed, I would have thought she just doesn't want to do things in any kind of good order, but they were in an order that mattered to her.
Mhm.
Um, Let me just give you do I have a second to give you a couple quick stories to go with learning styles. One of my daughters was one of those kids that you just wanted to say, please sit still for 5 minutes, just
Mhm.
5 minutes. I mean, no matter what you did, she was moving, she was bouncing, she was wiggling, and she could have sat still. And some of you have those kids, especially little boys, and she could have sat still. But when your kids wake up in the morning, they've recharged. You haven't, but they've recharged, and their battery is full. Diane Kraft from Colorado taught me this. Their batteries are full, and they can use that battery power all day long to learn new things, or they can learn it trying to sit still or trying to process in a way that's not simple for them. So they can do it, but at the expense of what? So
Mhm.
I found I had to find ways for her to learn while moving, because the
Mhm.
moving recharged her. So there's a lot of tools out there for you. But for example, we gave her a little cush ball because she could squeeze. We let her swing her feet under the table. We let her walk the room as she did some of her work. She memorized the entire book of Matthew, pacing the room. Um, Cherie Fuller talks about in her book Talkers, Watchers, and Doers about a teacher who brought an exercise bike into the classroom, and she let a little boy sit on it in the back. She said, when you feel antsy, you can go in the back of the room where people aren't looking at him, in the back of the room, and you can ride the bike. And so he seemed to be not paying a whole lot of attention, lost some focus, walked to the back, got on the bike, started pedaling, and said, oh, I can hear you now. It was like a physical disconnect for him when he couldn't move. So that daughter that I could have squelched when she was in first grade, not sitting still, when she was in eighth grade, she decided she wanted to explore ballet. Well, if you've ever had a child in dance, that is not the age you start ballet. So she was in a class of 4-year-olds. But that's what she wanted to do. So she moved quickly through that. She moved quickly through the next couple of levels. By the end of the year, she was in advanced class. By the next year, she was student teaching. By the time she graduated from high school, she was assistant director of the dance studio. And as an adult with 4 sons, as an adult, she's a dance teacher. And she actually met her husband in a ballroom dance class. God made her to move.
Mhm.
And if I had squelched that because it wasn't convenient, if I had squelched the way she processes, she wouldn't have been able to be who God wanted her to be. A friend of
Yeah.
mine's little boy was always making connecting things with strings. Like he would tie the doorknobs together down the hallway, or he would tie other things together. It drove his mom bonkers. Well, he grew up to be won't go through the whole story, but he grew up to be some kind of software engineer in the aeronautics field. He
Wow.
builds computer software because God made him to see connections. And his mom could have squelched that when he was little by saying, sit down, put the string away, and do your math work the way I'm telling you.
I
And
like to say that a compliment to one is not an insult to another. And so, in no way do I intend to insult another, but that's what I love about homeschooling is that we have these children who are fearfully and wonderfully made, and they don't all fit into the square peg. So, as a homeschooler, you can explore these modalities. You can explore their unique personalities. Like Sarah just said, her daughter is a wiggler and moves, and it doesn't have to be a disruption. It could be something. And so, I know we spent more time on talking
sorry.
about those, but oh, good. Just that story is encouraging for Sarah.
Well,
Thank you in the comments.
well, I just wanted to encourage you that sometimes that there's something that your child does that drives you bonkers that he doesn't even realize he's doing. And that is very likely not the thing he does to annoy you on purpose, but the thing that he does that drives you bananas, that he doesn't know he's doing, is very likely something God has put into him to accomplish his purpose. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't learn to harness it somewhat. I can't say my daughter's a wiggler, so I'm just going to let her run where she wants. She has to learn boundaries. But
Mhm.
I also need to recognize the gifts in her.
Mm.
So, anyway,
I
sorry.
love that. That was so good. So, even though it seems like a non-answer to say there's a lot of curriculum options, but I mean, I'm just reiterating what you said. Consider your child, consider that who they are, their strengths, and kind of be willing to adapt to find the right.
And to go back to the curriculum, just so that it doesn't sound like we've skipped over the whole thing and people are thinking, oh my goodness, you didn't answer the question. I have a workshop. It's a free video. It's 45 minutes long, called So You've Decided to Homeschool. Now What? And I actually go into a little bit more detail about curriculum and learning styles in there. So if anybody's interested, if we don't get to some of those questions, I wanted you to know that that does exist for you,
Yes.
as well as
Yes.
a curriculum workshop. So
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Because the curriculum really is the question that I'm always asked. What curriculum do I use? It's just not that simple because it's, well, tell me about your child. Tell
right.
me about where you want to
Yes,
go. What is
that's
your vision? What
that's
are you
right.
trying to foster? Yeah. And for me, it was really important that I taught my children, one, a biblical worldview. So I was always making sure it was foundation in that. But I also wanted to foster a love of learning. And you use that phrase to build, how do you phrase it? You have something that you say about curiosity, that's what we're trying to do is nurture curiosity or build curiosity.
A learning lifestyle, really exploring and learning. And uh, Renee and Mike Moseman, in their book, The Smarter Preschooler, I know that's preschool, but it kind of applies in everything. They talk about how it's important to create an intellectually stimulating environment versus an intellectually demanding environment, especially in the first earlier years of school before they get to middle and high school. So that's important. But I would like to, because we're talking about people pulling their kids out, if we have time, I'd love to mention
Sure.
remember we said your why is going to drive your what and your how. You may find that you change your curriculum approach based on where you are in your journey. When Going back to our analogy, I live in Virginia. I was going to speak in Arizona at the Arizona convention, and we decided to drive. I'm so bad at geography. I had no idea where it's all across the country. I mean, good grief,
Yeah,
anyway, don't know what I was thinking. But anyway,
days and days.
days and different days. So we drove across the country. And so because I had to be there at a certain time, we didn't stop along the way and do sightseeing. Car broke down twice, we had to fix it. But we just drove straight across the country and got to where I needed to get to do what I needed to do. Then once we'd accomplished that, then we did the 19 states in 15 days things coming back with the sightseeing and the Grand Canyon and the this and that and the other and all those things, because now we could do that. And it's the same thing with homeschooling. Some of you may be pulling a child out of a conventional school and you're trying to get to a certain place. You're not happy with where they were academically. You're feeling that you really that they fell through some cracks along the way, and you're trying to, I hate to use the term catch up, because behind what, but some of you may feel that your student really hasn't been meeting his potential here and you want to get to a certain point. You're going to pick something that is the direct route to get you where you're going. You're not going to do something that's got a whole bunch of bells and whistles. But once you get to the point in those skills subjects of math and language that you're comfortable with where your child is, or maybe you were comfortable all along, then you can select something that gives you the opportunity to take the rabbit trails.
I
So
love that visual. Oh my gosh. Say that again. Like that really is, that to me is the difference between, because I always say homeschooling is not doing school at home. So it's almost like doing school is the direct route. Like you just have a mission, vroom, and you're going through. But homeschooling can be this wonderful tour and these unexpected visits. And oh my gosh, that was profound.
well, Michael Grice did in the HEAV, Home Educators Association of Virginia magazine years ago. Michael Grice had published a story, and I won't do it justice, but the quick gist of it was that the kids asked for a cake. And he said, okay, what kind of cake do you want? And so research it. So they researched all the different kinds of cake and they decided they wanted to make a devil's food cake. Okay, well, so where does flour come from? So they end up with a whole, this 3-week study on the different kinds of flour, and they got wheat and they milled their own. And then they said, well, okay, now we need, what's the next? Well, we need eggs. Oh, so they got some chickens and they raised eggs and they got different kinds of chickens and different kinds of eggs. And well, where does the cocoa come from? And how do they, you don't even want to know how they get the red dye for the devil's food cake. But so they want, it's like 2 years go by and they haven't got this cake made yet because they've gone down all these little rabbit trails and they've learned so much about all the things that go into a cake. And um, if nobody told you when your child turned 5 that you had to do school with him, you would probably just explore the things that he was interested in, you were interested in, came up in life, you ran across, you read about, and then you build the skills that you need to go along with that. So anyway,
Oh, that's a cool story. I love that. Vicki, thanks.
sure,
That was a
sorry,
fun rabbit
I
trail for
talked
us.
too much. I'm sorry, I talked too much. I could talk
No,
forever.
not at all. I love it.
I love
So we did talk a little bit about deschooling. You mentioned it
that.
and the formula. So can you just give us a couple of examples of deschooling? I mean, it's kind of the rabbit trail idea, right?
Yeah, it
Like
really is.
they
It's
find something. Yeah.
some people may actually school like this long term. It's almost like a little mini version of unschooling. It's trying to reignite that love of learning in your child. Kids are born curious. Might have been what we were talking about earlier. Kids are born curious. God made kids to learn. Barring some kind of learning glitch, left to their own devices, children will learn. We put them in school situations with our external expectations, and we train the love of learning out of them.
Mhm.
So if you could tell your child for a couple of weeks, you can learn about anything you want to learn about. You can learn. Now, some of you are probably thinking, but my child wouldn't want to learn about anything. That may be true to begin with. You may have a child who has been so demoralized by the system itself that he doesn't know how to think or learn anymore. And it may take a little bit of time And in that case, I would, rather than just leaving him to his own devices, especially if you're talking about a little bit older child, I might look for some family projects that he could be involved in with you. Maybe you let him paint his room if that's something that's allowable. Maybe you let him rearrange some things in his room. Maybe you have him help you plan a trip to someplace he wants to go. Maybe he picks a hobby he wants to learn about. Why don't you pick a couple things you'd like us to have for supper, and you can help me cook them if he's into cooking or whatever. So there's just, or reading. If all your child did was read, you'd be golden. So just, you want to be careful what they're reading. But so really, again, it's just that time to adjust to the fact that he can learn. He just doesn't have to be
Mhm.
taught. That's a distinction. When we talk about materials, curriculum, that's a distinction I like to make. There are homeschool materials that are designed to be learned, and there are homeschool materials that are designed to be taught. In
Hmm.
the younger years, your children will just need the stuff that's designed to be taught anyway, because they're not reading yet on their own. They need you to work with them anyway. By the time my kids are reading fluently on their own, which I'm hoping is at least by third grade or so, then I am, maybe younger, but it's not unusual, believe it or not, for children to, we all think kids have to read at 4. Some kids don't read till they're 7 or 8, and there's nothing wrong with them. So, but I am going to be gearing up for my child who's in third or fourth grade and so on to be more and more self-guided, not instantly, obviously, but I'm weaning them off of my teaching them
Hmm.
and helping them to have more responsibility for their own learning, giving them more control, letting them make some choices, giving them some options in their day and things like that. And I'm going to be choosing material as much as possible that's written to or presented to the student, not for me to present. So anyway, and so that's the kind of thing you could be using during the deschooling. It could be picking a couple of educational videos.
Hmm.
Anyway, more than you wanted to know about
You
that.
could have a sports fanatic who wants to do like
Yes.
making a graph and looking into all the tops from every era. Yeah. I mean,
At least once a year, we did a choose your own unit study for my kids. We did a lot of unit studies, and I selected them because I had kind of an order. I had an order of things that I wanted to do. I tried to give them flexibility within the units, but I had a continuum. But once a year, I tried to let them pick their own. And one year, one of my kids picked chocolate. So she had like 4 weeks. She could do anything she wanted. She picked chocolate. I said, you don't get to just eat chocolate for 4 weeks. You have to you have to have a plan to show me what you learned. So at the end of the time period, she did a chocolate tasting party. She gave a little oral report, which was like pulling teeth, a little oral report on the history of chocolate. And then she had made a bunch of different things using different types of chocolate. And she ended up entering them in the state fair and winning some blue ribbons. But
wow,
we invited family and friends over. And so they just had a really good time. But that's outside the box thinking. So,
I love it. I love it.
yeah.
I love it so much. My children are adults and I just want to do it again. It's so much fun. I love that. Are you homeschooling grandkids? Are you part of any of that?
I just try to be there. My daughters and my granddaughters are great at what they do. They're all they've all either homeschooled or are homeschooling or were homeschooling at some point. So
Yeah, so fun. Okay, well, we got to talk about something before we close. I definitely want to get to this because our audience is really mostly people who are maybe disenchanted and it's hard. There's a reason and usually that reason is a negative reason that they are pulling their kids out of school mid-year. So let's talk about some pain points.
okay,
And I've heard you Vicky, you and I are very similar in our like passion of learning, but I am not like you in the order and structure. But I love so much about what you said. So, and I think you talked about using order and structure to kind of preemptively deal with pain points. But let's talk about pain points. And when I say that, I'm talking about the things I hear all the time. Somebody, one, feeling unqualified,
sure.
balancing life with school, having a disgusting house or feeling like it's messy or you can't keep up with chores, and what if the kids hate it and they're crying and they don't want to do school? I mean, I gave you three very different pain points, but what do you think?
Well, the first one on the feeling unqualified, I'd like to save to the end because I
Okay.
actually, one of the things you asked me to do at the end was share something that we hadn't covered. And I have something I want to read to you. I think that's going to
Okay.
cover that. So
Perfect.
remind me on that. Balancing life with school. I think the word balance may be an interesting choice there, because I think of it more as harmony, because it's not going to be balanced depending upon where you are in the process. If you've got lots of little kids, you're going to be doing a lot of the schooly part. If school age, if you've got a lot of babies, you're going to end up with a lot more of the life thing. You're a family first. So just keep in mind that you are a family first. Learning will still happen in the context of family, but it doesn't work the other way around. I have an article on the website called When Life Broadsides Your Homeschool, because I talk to families who say, I had a great plan in September. Everything was good. I had a lesson plan book. We were ready to go. And it's March. And I don't know what we've been doing for the last 3 months. I'm so far behind. I don't know behind. There's that phrase again, behind what? But I'm so far behind where I'd hoped to be. I don't even know where to go from here. And so I have some tips for you in there about, first of all, deciding what's important. And usually the first thing I tell people is not the curriculum stuff. Let go of that for a minute. Let's look at your routine, not schedule. I'm not a huge fan of schedule. Some people do really well with that. I like to think more of routine. I'm not a let's ding the bell and go from thing to thing, but I think that children benefit from having a pattern to their day, a rhythm, they know what comes next. They find security in knowing what we do next each day. Even if Monday is always different from Tuesday, they know that on Mondays we do this, on Tuesdays we do this. There's a pattern to the day. So, but as far as balancing life with school, it may be a matter of paring down what is essential in your household and what is essential in your homeschooling. Let's get down to the things that have to happen and then add from there. Once it's I do a workshop called Juggling Life and Lesson Plans. We talk about the fact that when somebody learns to juggle, because we're looking at juggling life and school here. When somebody learns to juggle, they don't start with 7 balls in the air. They start with 1. They have 1 ball and they toss it up and down, and they probably drop that a bunch. Just you're thinking you had 1 job, 1 ball, and you dropped it. But that's going to happen as you're learning to homeschool. If all you do is start off with, we're just going to start off reading together. For the first 3 weeks, we're going to get up, we're going to take care of our personal stuff in the house, and we're going to read. And then, 3 weeks later, we're going to add math. And 3 weeks later, we're going to add something else. You're juggling. You're starting off with something that you're good at. And when you get that down pat, you add another ball.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you get to the point that you're dropping balls, you got too many balls in the air. What's going to go? And that's when you need to evaluate that. So
That is good.
you asked
So
about what
what
go ahead.
No, go ahead. You were finishing what I asked about, right? The curriculum, if
What if the
nobody's
curriculum
liking it,
is
they're
yeah, nobody
trying.
likes
Yeah.
the curriculum. If nobody likes the curriculum, uh, I always say, call me and we'll talk about it. Talk to somebody else about what some options may be, or look at some other options. If nobody likes it, it's not going to work. If how do I say this? Your kids aren't always going to love what you're doing. I saw something once. I wish I'd written it down. It was actually a public school teacher leader who said, if you aren't having fun at least 80% of the time, you're doing it wrong. And so I like to think of that here. If my daughter just is actually in the middle of writing a book, it should be going to print really soon on Christian unschooling, and she's not advocating that everybody should unschool, but one of the things that was important to her was she got up. My daughter's chronically ill, and so it's a big effort for her to get up every day and have to fight with her kids about doing their school stuff. And she realized, they're not wanting to do it, and they're asking, why do I have to learn this? And then I have to ask myself, why do they have to learn this? Is this something that's so important to me that it's worth us fighting over? Or is there another way to learn this? Is there another way to introduce this? Can they learn it in a different context? So if the curriculum is torture, nobody seems to like it, switch it up. Even if it's just one subject, you may find that you still want to stick with your math and language because it's comfortable and it's the skill subjects, but maybe you switch up your science and history a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
And I think I skipped over it. Oh no, it's the next. I loved it. Was the first time I ever heard this. cycle? Because I used to do like this grand planning session when I started homeschooling. I would take a month and I would have books and calendars and have this whole, and it didn't always go to plan, but you have this brilliant suggestion and I love it. And I feel like, where was this? I needed this.
Well, where was it when I started too? I started off homeschooling just like you mentioned. I didn't know anybody else who homeschooled. And so I went to the teacher supply store because you couldn't go buy a homeschool planner. I went to the teacher supply store and bought a little brown leatherette 30 kid planner. And I planned my entire 180 days of school in ink because it was neater. Well, you know what happens. You're laughing because you know what happens. Day 3, somebody doesn't get the math lesson. Spent 177 days feeling like you're behind. So, and I also realized we were homeschooling in a community where all the kids got on the bus. And so I was going by the same schedule that they were on. Well, they had teacher work days and all these other things that I wasn't getting. And I realized I was burning out really fast. And what I came to realize, this was just for me. So you have to use your judgment. But I said to myself, I can do anything for 8 weeks at a time if I know I'm getting a week off. So we ended up going 8 weeks on, 1 week off, 8 weeks on, take off the month at Christmas time. 8 weeks on, and then we did this cycle. So we took off. Oh, so it was 5 cycles, and there was a week between each cycle, and there was a month off at Christmas time and a month off in the middle of the summer. And that was important to me because what was happening before was if we weren't where I thought we were supposed to be in my lesson planning, the whole year was off. So what I learned to do, and I have an article on lesson planning on the website where I've got photos for you where you can see it, was I outlined for the whole year very, very roughly. Like I would like to do this book and these units and such and such. But so I had a plan for the year that took pressure off of me. But I only lesson planned it 8 weeks at a time. I only put it in writing in pencil for 8 weeks at a time. And then at the end of the 8 weeks, I would take that week off to evaluate where are we compared to where I thought we would be, and why is that? Am I on track for where I thought we would be? If not, were my expectations too high? Was the material wrong? Was everybody sick? What was going on? And I could regroup from there. And then the next time we would start with where we are and move forward. So that just worked really well for us. So
I think that's a great because it gives you a good time to reevaluate. And that's really what we're talking about. I think the biggest encouragement to families who are just now starting, you're not going to get it right. You're going to fall on your face. You're going to try something. The kids are going to hate it. You're going to hate it. And then you're going to
that's
go,
right.
wait a minute. Let
It's
me let me talk to some experts or experts and you're going to try again. So I think this is a worthy calling and I hope that families stick to it. So I want to we're nearing towards our end. I would love to hear the conclusion of your daughter's story, the title of that, and then will you share something that you feel like we didn't cover?
sure. Um, well, the end of my daughter's story, and actually, like I told you, the it's on the website. You can actually read part of the story for yourself. Um, a friend of mine wrote a book called, it was edited a book called See, I Told Me So. It's a compilation of stories because when you start off, you think, oh, everything's going to be great. You get about 2 days into homeschooling and then you second guess yourself for 15
Yeah.
years. And then at the end, you look and you say, oh, they turned out okay. See, I told me so. And so it was stories from people who had been there, done that. And she thought it'd be really cool to add the stories of people of graduates who had finished. And so she asked my daughter to write one of the stories, but I didn't get to read the chapter until it was in print. And it
Oh,
was called I Hated Homeschooling. And I thought, oh my goodness, I speak all over the country about homeschooling, and my daughter's got this. But it was so valuable because what she shared in there was that her her family, we started homeschooling in earnest with her in middle school. And she says, my family didn't have my heart. My parents didn't have my, she said, I had a better than average relationship with my family, with my parents, but they didn't have my heart. My friends did. My younger siblings were just kind of a nuisance. She said, but if my parents had not homeschooled me, I'm not saying that in a non-homeschooling setting you can't have a good relationship. I'm just saying she recognized it for her. Had we not taken those steps, she said, my parents would still not be where my heart was. God, they wouldn't have drawn my heart back to themselves. They wouldn't have drawn my heart to God. I would still be closer to my friends than to my family. She said, she goes on to say that, trying to think how she worded it, basically that I didn't always, homeschooling wasn't what I wanted, but you can tell this is off the cuff. Homeschooling wasn't what I wanted, but homeschooling was what I needed. And I'm
Yes.
so thankful for parents who recognize the difference. And so I just wanted to let you know that, just so you know, she did not run off when she was 18 and get married. She waited till she was 20 and she married a pastor. And meanwhile, she had written me several thank you notes for, homeschooling her and doing the hard things, even when people, whether it was family or church or whatever, was negative about it. She thanked us for sticking with it. And then, like I said, and now she's married. She has 5 kids. They're all homeschooled. Her husband worked in the homeschooling arena. She works in the homeschooling arena. And so I think God just has an amazing sense of humor. But one of the things that I wanted to share with you, and I want to go back to the question that you had about people, and I know that one of the number one thoughts anybody listening to this has, whether you're just starting to homeschool or you have homeschooled for 15 years, one of your top concerns is, am I doing enough?
Mhm.
I can tell you that because I did a survey. If you've ever watched the Family Feud game show and they say we surveyed 100 men and asked this question, and how many of them had this? I played Family Feud and I surveyed 100 families across the country. And one of the questions I asked was, what is your number one fear about homeschooling? And the number one answer, blowing everything else out of the water, was some variation of, I'm not doing enough. My kids won't know what they need. My kids are going to resent me because I'm not doing it well. It was always that I'm not qualified to do this. So I want
Mhm.
to read something to, first of all, I want to tell you that you are the expert on your child. There's no one right way to homeschool. I hope that's something you've gotten out of here is, we may talk about different approaches. There's no one right way to do this. So just be intentional about what you're choosing to do with your kids. But I did this little meme, it was on my website. It says, some suggest that devoting 10,000 hours to studying and practicing a subject or a skill helps you achieve the level of expert, while others believe it could take 20,000 or 25,000 hours to master that. So if you go with the 25,000 hours, we'll just go with the biggest one, and you account for just a week time. If you've spent, we'll go with 14 hours a day. If you spend 14 hours a day with your child, that's 4.89 years to reach expert training level. So I want you to let that sink in a minute. That means by the time your child is school age, you are the expert on your child. And I want to read something to you that I gave to some coworkers, and I just think it's valuable for us as moms as well. I don't know if you've noticed in my little mug, I have, I don't know if you can
I
see this.
did notice the
It's
loaves
the
and the
love
fish.
of fishes. And I gave some little charms to some of my coworkers. And I think it's appropriate for you parents as well. It says, we often feel so inadequate as we serve our families or those around us because they have such great needs, like the hungry multitudes in the Gospels of Matthew and John. The boy brought all that he had, 5 loaves and 2 fish. They're very seemingly insignificant offerings. But Jesus took what the boy had to offer and he made it more than enough. When we, as parents, when we give Jesus all that we have, as insignificant as it may seem, he miraculously makes it more than enough for his glory. So I just want to encourage you that it doesn't matter what your education level is. They've done studies. Kids who are homeschooled average in the mid 70s on standardized percentiles on standardized achievement tests. The mid to upper 70th percentile is the average range for kids taking a nationally normed standardized achievement test as homeschoolers versus public school students where the average is 50. Not picking on anybody, just saying that's how that works out. Whether the parent dropped out of high school or has a 4-year degree, there's only a 1-point spread in that percentile point.
Mm.
It's not about how much you know. It's about how willing you are to do what you need to do to make sure your child gets the skills he needs and the opportunities to build those skills and to be the expert on your child. And I know that you can do this.
That was a beautiful way to close it. That so thank you so, so much.